10:22 a.m., 25,000 feet over southern Germany. The contrails look peaceful from below, but above them, the sky is about to split apart. 291 B-17 flying fortresses of the U.S. 1st Bomb Division are spread across the blue in rigid formation, each one bristling with 50 caliber guns. 10 men inside every aircraft. 2,900 souls flying into the heart of the Reich. Their target, the Kugelfischer ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, the industrial nerve center of the German war machine. Every tank tread, aircraft propeller, and vehicle axle depends on the bearings made in that valley. Destroy them, and the war stops. That's the theory, but the math of theory is always different from the math of air combat. The B-17s are flying deep, beyond the reach of Allied fighters. The escorting P-47 Thunderbolts have turned back 50 miles ago, short on fuel. The bomber crews know what that means. They're on their own. At 10:23, radar operators in Germany report massive inbound formation. Airfields from Würzburg to Stuttgart scramble fighters. The Luftwaffe launches everything that can climb. 300 interceptors, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, twin-engines air-storers, rise into the contrails like wasps. Inside, the lead bomber, Captain Robert Rosenthal of the 100th Bomb Group, scans the sky through his plexiglass nose. He sees black dots above, shimmering against the sunlight. They're not dots. They're fighters, dozens, then hundreds, forming a line so thick it looks like an oil stain across the sky. The intercom crackles. "Bandits at 12 o'clock high!" Engines roar. The first wave dives. Tracers slice through the formation. A fortress explodes in mid-air, no time to bail out. Another loses a wing, spinning like a leaf. The Germans are attacking from every direction, timed in intervals of 20 seconds. Rosenthal's bombardier calls out flak bursts ahead. Black puffs, close and rhythmic. The fortress shakes. Glass shatters. Oxygen hisses through torn hoses. A gunner screams over the radio, "Tail gun's gone!" The waist gunners return fire. Arcs of red tracers crisscrossing the sky. For every German fighter that burns, 2 more replace it. In the chaos, the formation holds. That's the rule. No breaks, no evasions, no lone dives. Formation is survival. The overlapping arcs of their guns create a single sphere of fire. If they scatter, they die. At 11:03, the bomb doors open. The B-17s drop their payloads, 600 tons of bombs tumbling toward the city below. The entire valley flashes white. The shockwave rocks the bombers even at 5 miles up. But the Luftwaffe isn't done. They follow the bombers all the way to the border. German ace Egon Meyer leads a frontal attack, head-on at 400 miles per hour, his cannons firing into cockpit glass. His rounds strike a B-17 named Royal Flush. The nose disintegrates. The co-pilot dies instantly. Rosenthal, bloodied but conscious, keeps his hands on the controls. One engine's gone, the second coughing. 2 more fortresses on his wing drop out of formation. One bursts into flames, another nosedives. Through the smoke, Rosenthal sees the channel glinting far west. He refuses to turn back. Hours later, Royal Flush crosses the English coast with 2 engines dead, fuselage shredded, half the crew wounded. The landing gear refuses to lower. They skid onto the runway in a storm of sparks. Ground crews rush forward, eyes wide. The aircraft looks impossible, holes through every surface, fabric flapping where aluminum used to be. Rosenthal climbs out, covered in soot and blood, and mutters the only words that make sense: "She brought us home." Of the 291 and bombers that took off that morning, 60 never returned. 600 airmen dead, 200 captured. But 229 made it home. That day, The legend of the Flying Fortress became something more than propaganda. It became proof that metal and math could keep men alive inside hell. And from that day forward, when the crews climbed aboard their bombers, they didn't ask if they would come home. They asked how many engines it would take. Before the mission to Schweinfurt, the Flying Fortress already had a mythology. To the American public, it was the plane that could take anything and still come home. A steel angel immune to flak, faster than death. Newsreels showed B-17s landing with holes big enough to crawl through, their crews smiling, waving, lighting cigarettes for the cameras. The press called it the invincible bomber. But the crews knew better. Inside the fuselage, the Fortress was just thin aluminum skin, barely thicker than a coin. The armor plating around vital stations covered only a few feet of cockpit and gun positions. The rest was fabric and faith. When flak burst near, the fragments didn't just puncture metal, they shredded lungs, arteries, and hope. The myth of invincibility came from a single truth. The B-17 could take damage, massive damage, and keep flying. But that didn't mean the men inside always did. Between late 1942 and mid-1943, the average life expectancy of a bomber crewman in the 8th Air Force was 11 missions. They needed 25 to finish a tour. Mathematically, most never made it. Still, the stories spread. In bars near Thorpe Abbotts and Bassingbourn, airmen told of Fortresses landing with wings missing, with dead pilots still strapped in while co-pilots flew them home. It wasn't fiction. Ground crews had counted more than 100 holes in a single aircraft that returned from Bremen. Another came home from Hamburg with its tail nearly severed, kept together by control cables. The Germans saw the same myth through a different lens. They nicknamed the bomber Viermol, the four-motor beast, and viewed it with grudging respect. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland admitted, "It was no target for a single fighter. It was a formation of guns." But there was one misunderstanding on both sides. The B-17 wasn't indestructible. It was redundant. Everything about it was built for backup. 4 engines meant it could lose 1, sometimes 2, and still climb. Twin rudders allowed it to steer even if half its tail was gone. Every vital system had a secondary route: hydraulic lines, electrical circuits, fuel feeds. It was the architecture of endurance. That's what the public mistook for invincibility. Design layered like armor, engineering substituting for luck. For the men inside, luck was still the currency of survival. In interviews after missions, gunners described the horror as calmly as accountants. One waist gunner said, "If you heard flak, it wasn't yours. If you didn't hear it, you were already dead." Others joked about it, gallows humor that filled the gaps between raids. "The B-17 can survive anything," one navigator quipped, "except bad math." He meant the odds. Every mission deeper into Germany stretched the equation thinner. Longer flight time, heavier defenses, higher losses. The further they went, the more the myth cracked. By summer 1943, daylight raids had become statistical suicide. When the 8th Air Force hit Regensburg and Schweinfurt for the first time, 60 bombers were lost in one day, roughly 1 out of every 4. Back in Washington, generals defended the losses by saying the B-17 was proving the doctrine. They were right. It proved that even the toughest machine on Earth couldn't win alone. The crews knew it. The mechanics knew it. But the headlines still called them the Flying Fortresses. In truth, they weren't flying fortresses. They were flying compromises, masterpieces of engineering that gave a man a small, measurable chance against chaos. What made the legend immortal wasn't the armor or the guns or the engines. It was the simple fact that even when burning, twisting, and breaking apart, the fortress kept its promise. It would give its crew a chance. A chance to make it to the Channel. A chance to see England again. And in 1943, that chance was enough to make ordinary men climb aboard, day after day, knowing exactly what awaited them. The B-17 was never just an airplane. It was a machine built by a civilization that believed precision could win wars. Its story began in 1935 when Boeing's Model 299 lifted off from a Seattle airfield for the first time. It was sleek, metallic, and far too advanced for its time. 4 engines, retractable landing gear, a 2,000-mile range, and a nose full of machine guns. The reporters who watched that flight gave it its name on the spot, Flying Fortress. The Air Corps saw the future in it, but also the price tag. At $99,000 apiece, the B-17 was a gamble during a depression. Boeing built just 13 prototypes. One crashed during testing, killing the program's pilot and nearly the project itself. For 5 years, the Fortress sat in limbo. Too expensive for peacetime, too advanced for planners who still dreamed of dogfights, not factories in the sky. Then came 1939. Europe ignited, and America's doctrine changed overnight. Bombers weren't a luxury anymore. They were a necessity. Boeing received the contract. Within 2 years, Seattle's assembly lines were roaring 24 hours a day. Aluminum sheet became wings. Wings became production. The design logic of the B-17 was mathematical, every failure point backed by another. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each 1,200 horsepower, spaced far enough apart that one could explode without destroying the wing. Armor plating cocooned the pilots, navigator and bombardier. Self-sealing fuel tanks swelled and closed under heat. Gun turrets covered every angle, nose, tail, top, belly, and sides, each armed with 50 caliber Brownings. By the B-17G model, 13 guns turned the aircraft into a flying hedgehog of fire. Inside, the aircraft was pure function. There were no seats for most of the crew, just metal floors, cables, and frost on the walls at 25,000 feet. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built to keep 10 men breathing long enough to drop 6 tons of bombs from 5 miles up. On the ground, it became the heartbeat of an economy. In Seattle, Boeing's Plant 2 employed over 30,000 workers, most of them women by 1943. In Lockheed Vega's California facilities and Douglas's Long Beach assembly lines, more joined. Together, they built a B-17 every 63 minutes by 1944. Photographs show rows of bombers stretching to the horizon, silver wings under skylights, rivet guns echoing like thunder. Meanwhile, Germany was fragmenting its production. Allied bombers had forced Messerschmitt and Junkers to scatter their factories underground, slowing everything down. While one American city could assemble hundreds of aircraft in a week, the Reich was building fighters in tunnels and caves, engines without airframes without fuel. The B-17 wasn't just a machine of war, it was proof of organizational power. Its supply chain stretched from Pittsburgh steel mills to Kansas propeller plants to the Alcoa aluminum foundries in Tennessee. Every rivet that held a fortress together had traveled through 5 factories before it reached Seattle. Boeing engineers joked that the real genius of the plane wasn't aerodynamics, it was paperwork. The logistics worked like an orchestra. Engines shipped west by rail, turrets from Minnesota, ball bearings from Ohio. Every 3 days, another convoy of flat cars rolled into Boeing Field. Across the ocean, Germany's engineers fought to match it with innovation. Heavier guns, faster fighters, better flak. But innovation couldn't outpace repetition. For every B-17 destroyed, 3 more were already being painted with squadron markings. When the first combat groups arrived in England in 1942, British pilots were stunned. "They look like an armada," one RAF officer said, watching a formation of fortresses take off in perfect synchronization. He wasn't wrong. It was an armada of industry. Each aircraft carried more than its crew. It carried a system, 1,000,000 workers behind every bomb bay, 1,000 factories in every fuselage. That's what made the B-17 terrifying to Germany. Not its speed, not its guns, but the certainty that for every fortress they shot down, an identical one would take its place. And when that system met the limits of human endurance in the skies above Schweinfurt, the question wasn't whether the fortress could survive. It was whether the men inside it could keep up with the machine. Every B-17 carried 10 men, 10 parachutes, 10 chances to defy gravity, and math. At the height of the daylight bombing campaign in 1943, the numbers were merciless. The average crewman's odds of surviving a 25-mission tour were roughly 1 in 4. For new groups, it was worse. A gunner in the 100th Bomb Group had a better chance of dying than a U.S. Marine storming Tarawa. In the first year of combat, the 8th Air Force lost over 2,400 B-17s. That's 24,000 airmen. The Army kept track with chilling precision. 9.1 men per aircraft multiplied by total losses equals names carved into stone. Each bomber cost $238,000 to build, about $5 million today. Every mission carried $2 million worth of machinery into the flak corridor, and some never came back. But the math didn't just count machines. It measured endurance. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees. Exposed flesh froze to metal in seconds. The oxygen masks iced over, the guns jammed from frost, and the vibration of 4 engines pounded every nerve for 8 straight hours. Each bomber carried 6,000 rounds of ammunition. Crews burned through them all on a single raid, spewing brass casings that clattered like rain across the floor. Defensive fire was measured in geometry. 13 .50 caliber Brownings created interlocking cones of lead, an airborne phalanx. But statistics still ruled. For every 1,000 rounds fired, maybe one hit. A single lucky 20mm shell from a Bf-109 could still blow the fortress apart. The Luftwaffe exploited the gaps between those cones. Fighters attacked in head-on pairs, closing at 400 km. The engagement window? 6 seconds. 6 seconds to see, aim, and survive. Back in England, commanders at High Wycombe studied loss graphs that looked like falling stock markets. Schweinfurt Regensburg, August 17, 1943. 376 bombers launched, 60 lost. Münster, October 10, 26 of 30 from the 100th Bomb Group shot down. Average loss rate, 26%. The math of morale followed close behind. At Thorpe Abbott's, new crews measured time in breakfasts, not missions. The base's chaplain said every Sunday we prayed for math to take a day off. Yet the system held. Because the same arithmetic that killed them also protected them. Redundancy was its own equation. Lose one engine, you still had 3. Lose hydraulics, hand crank the gear. Lose a pilot, the co-pilot could fly from the right seat. Every fortress was a self-contained probability problem, each backup raising survival odds by a few percentage points. Those percentages mattered. They turned chaos into procedure. Crews learned the formula of endurance. Stay in formation equals higher survival rate. Break formation equals certain death. At 25,000 feet, discipline wasn't about courage, it was algebra. Even rescue logistics had math. Air-sea rescue trawlers patrolled the channel in fixed grids. A downed crew had 20 minutes before hypothermia. Each minute lost equaled 1 man drowned. By mid-1944, escort fighters changed the entire equation. P-51s extended the survival curve beyond the Rhine, and bomber losses fell from 26% to below 5%. But in 1943, before those long-range angels arrived, The men in the fortresses flew, knowing the numbers were against them. Each mission brief ended the same way. Gentlemen, statistically, 1 in 5 of you won't return. Now mount up. The arithmetic of survival wasn't fair. It wasn't merciful, but it was measurable. And somehow, the crews kept climbing into the sky, willing to play the equation again. They weren't chasing glory. They were buying time. One sortie, one formation, one piece of a larger calculation that said maybe, just maybe, the fortress could fly long enough for the world below to breathe again. October 14, 1943. Black Thursday. The day the sky over Germany became a furnace. At dawn, the airfields of eastern England roared to life. Crews strapped in, their breath visible in the cold. Ground crewmen in coveralls loaded the last 500-pound bombs under the wings, signed the chalkboard manifest, and stepped back. Over the radio, the briefing officer's words still echoed in every man's mind. No fighter escort beyond Aachen. You're on your own. 221 B-17s lifted off into the gray light, engines howling. Their destination, Schweinfurt. Again, the same city that had nearly bled the 8th Air Force dry 2 months earlier. The first raid had damaged the ball-bearing factories but not destroyed them. Command wanted the job finished. The crews just wanted to come home. By mid-morning, the formation stretched for nearly 100 miles, a glittering metal river flowing east. They climbed through thin ice clouds to 25,000 feet. The contrails built walls in the sky, so dense that ground observers in Belgium described them as highways of smoke. At 10:15, German radar picked them up. Sirens wailed across Bavaria. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled from every airfield. Augsburg, Würzburg, Ansbach, Stuttgart. More than 300 fighters took to the air. They formed up above the bombers, then dove through the formation in waves of 20. The first attacks hit at 10:22. Bf-109s and FW-190s screamed head-on into the fortresses, firing 20mm cannon rounds that tore through the aluminum like foil. The front gunners fired back, their tracers carving red lines through the sky. When the first B-17 exploded, the concussion shook the entire formation. Black smoke rose where men had been seconds earlier. Inside one aircraft, Royal Flush, the bombardier saw the wing of the ship beside him shear off. It fluttered downward, spinning like a leaf. Parachutes bloomed, then burned. In the lead group, Captain Robert Rosenthal tried to keep formation, his co-pilot already wounded by shrapnel. Oxygen hoses flapped in the wind where the nose glass had shattered. Blood froze on the metal. Still, they held the line. That was the rule. Never break formation. Every gun in the formation depended on overlapping fields of fire. If one fortress turned away, it exposed the rest. So they stayed, even as the air filled with black flak bursts from the ground. Perfectly timed, perfectly lethal. At 11, the bomb bay doors opened. 1,700 tons of bombs fell toward the ball-bearing plants below. Schweinfurt disappeared in a cloud of dust and fire. But as the bombers turned for home, the Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters hit them from behind using new rockets that detonated between aircraft. One fortress, Sir Baboon Magoon, lost both right engines. The pilot feathered them, trimming the controls by hand. Another B-17, Wee Willie, was hit in the tail. The gunner decapitated instantly. Yet the plane stayed in formation. Radio chatter dissolved into chaos. Crews shouted over static, "We're hit! Bail out! Bail out! Tails gone! Still flying!" The formation broke apart over the Rhine. By the time the survivors reached the channel, the sky behind them was empty. Out of 291 bombers launched, 60 had been destroyed outright. 138 more were damaged so badly they would never fly again. Nearly 600 men were dead or missing. At Thorpe Abbot's, ground crews waited by the runway. They counted the returning aircraft, each minute slower, fewer, more silent. One Fortress came in on one engine, leaking fuel, hydraulic fluid pouring from its belly. Another landed with its nose wheel gone, grinding sparks across the tarmac. A third dropped from the sky short of the runway, cartwheeling into a field. Everyone inside, already gone. Rosenthal's Royal Flush limped home with holes the size of fists across the fuselage, a dead co-pilot, and one working engine. When it rolled to a stop, ground crews stared in disbelief. Of the 2,900 men who had left that morning, only 1,300 returned. Few aircraft were undamaged. The Schweinfurt raid had cost more American lives in a single day than the entire Battle of Midway. Yet the mission had proven something brutal and undeniable. Even shredded, burning, half-destroyed, the B-17s stayed in formation. They hit their target. They came home. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. And in war, enough was victory. In the weeks after Schweinfurt, silence fell over the airfields of England. The hangars still smelled of burned fuel and hydraulic oil. Rows of empty bunks lined the barracks. Chaplains wrote letters home and say, ground crews cleaned out the blood from waste gun positions. Even the pigeons that roosted on the control towers were quieter. The numbers from October 14th told the story no propaganda film could. 60 bombers lost. 17% casualty rate. Every aircraft carried 10 men, 600 killed, 200 captured. And those who came back weren't the same. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commander of the 305th Bomb Group, walked among the survivors and said nothing. The mission had been a success on paper. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were damaged again, production down for weeks. But in practice, the math was unsustainable. At that loss rate, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within 2 months. Yet for the planners in High Wycombe, failure wasn't an option. They believed in the doctrine of precision daylight bombing, the idea that high-altitude raids could cripple Germany's industry without destroying its cities. It was an American promise, born from faith in technology. Bomb sites, formation flying, and discipline would replace the carpet bombing of the RAF's night raids. The problem was physics. At 25,000 feet, a 500-pound bomb took 38 seconds to fall. A crosswind of just 10 mph pushed it 200 yards off target. Even a perfect bombardier couldn't control that. Schweinfurt showed the flaw, precision required repetition, and repetition demanded survival. Every mission into Germany became an equation. Number of aircraft launched x probability of reaching target versus x probability of returning a Sears-Sulzer strategic effect. Before long-range escort fighters, that final term kept collapsing. In the winter of 1943, the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions altogether. Factories at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Leipzig were left untouched for months. The crews called it the quiet time. They trained, rebuilt, and watched replacements arrive. Kids barely 20 with no idea what those black smoke trails meant. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe refined its own math. New twin-engine fighters with rockets, heavier cannons, and better coordination. Their mission profiles shortened. Fuel shortages forced them to fight close to home, but within that bubble, they were lethal. Each side was evolving, turning data into doctrine. In Washington, analysts at the Army Air Forces calculated new mission formulas: formation density, altitude adjustment, bomb load per plane, and acceptable loss ratios. Every pilot lost became a variable in an equation for efficiency. They were dying to complete the math. Commanders didn't call it cruelty. They called it correction. The more the fortresses bled, the smarter the strategy became. The cost of learning was written in crew rosters erased from morning roll call. Back in Seattle, the factories never stopped. They built faster than men could be trained to fly them. By December, Boeing had shipped another 1,000 bombers to England. The machine of industry was now feeding on its own pace. In the mess halls, airmen joked bitterly, "We're not fighting for freedom. We're fighting for statistics." They weren't wrong. The Schweinfurt raid proved the fortress could survive hits no plane should. But it also proved that survival alone couldn't win the war. The Allies needed escort fighters, radar jamming, improved targeting, the full system of modern warfare. Precision bombing had turned into a blood calculus, and men like LeMay and Eaker were the accountants. Every destroyed factory, every burned city, every mission canceled or flown came down to the same cold ratio: cost versus effect. Schweinfurt's factories eventually recovered. Germany's ball-bearing output dropped only 38% after the raid, less than intelligence predicted. Thousands of men had died to dent a number. And yet the lesson stuck. By early 1944, the Americans no longer chased precision. They chased dominance. They shifted from surgical strikes to industrial paralysis. Bomb everything: rail lines, oil, aircraft plants. Make the Reich run out of air before its pilots did, but that shift came at a price: a season of empty beds and folded flags. The myth of the fortress had met its breaking point. From now on, survival wouldn't be the miracle. It would be the strategy. Thorpe Abbotts, England. Autumn, 1943. The 100th Bomb Group had already earned a nickname whispered across the 8th Air Force: the Bloody Hundredth. No other unit had taken so many losses in so little time. Their emblem was a cartoon eagle clutching a bomb, but the men joked it should have been a tombstone. Out of every mission, at least one plane didn't return. Sometimes half, sometimes more. On October 10th, just 4 days before the second Schweinfurt raid, the 100th flew to Münster. 13 fortresses climbed through low cloud, engines droning in perfect unison. By the time they turned for home, 12 had vanished. Only one, a battered B-17 named Royal Flush, made it back. The survivors who watched from the control tower saw the sky burning over Germany and said nothing. The pattern was set. The 100th wasn't just unlucky, it was cursed. Yet every morning, the field roared again. Crews loaded bombs, checked oxygen lines, kissed Lucky Charms, and climbed aboard. For them, superstition was a survival mechanism. One pilot carried a rabbit's foot. Another taped a photograph of his wife over the altimeter. The ground crews fueled the fortresses in silence, avoiding eye contact with the returning planes or what was left of them. The burned paint, shredded aluminum, and missing gunners said enough. A waste gunner named Sergeant Harry Crosby later wrote in his diary, "We don't fly missions anymore. We endure them." Inside the fortress, endurance was ritual. Engines warmed. The smell of coffee and cordite filled the cabin. The navigator plotted the course over flak, heavy towns marked with black pins on the map. The intercom check followed the same pattern every time. "Pilot to crew, all positions report. Tail gun ready. Top turret ready. Ball turret ready." Each voice cracked, but no one hesitated. When the bombers lifted off, the English fields fell away beneath them. Within an hour, they'd be over enemy territory. The first flak bursts came like black blossoms against the pale sky. The 100th had learned a grim rhythm. The first 20 minutes were the worst. After that, you stopped caring about dying, you only cared about formation. The rule was sacred: stay in formation. Alone, you were a target. Together, you were a fortress of fortresses. During one mission over Bremen, the 100th was hit by more than 150 German fighters. The attacks came in waves, head-on, from below, from the sun. One B-17 took 23 direct cannon hits and still held altitude. The pilot, Lieutenant Harry Croover, flew home with 2 engines gone, hydraulics destroyed, and the fuselage full of holes. When he landed, his crew chief counted 1,200 bullet impacts. Croover walked away, turned to his co-pilot and said, "See, she gets us home." That line became gospel. The fortress's reliability turned despair into faith. But faith has limits. By November, Thorpe Abbott's casualty lists filled entire bulletin boards. New crews arrived faster than old ones could be buried. The base command began rotating survivors out after 20 missions just to keep them sane. The Luftwaffe called the 100th the suicide group. German radio propaganda even mentioned them by name. The bloody 100th dies again today. They didn't stop flying. In December, the group led a strike on Bremen's shipyards. 60 miles from the target, flak hit the lead plane. The cockpit filled with smoke, but the pilot refused to break formation. He dropped his bombs blind and guided the crippled aircraft home, landing it on 2 engines. When the crew climbed out, they found the entire tail held on by 1 spar. That photograph, the tail nearly gone, the crew standing beside it, became iconic. Newspapers called it proof of the fortress. But to the men who flew it, it was proof of something else. Survival wasn't heroism. It was procedure, discipline, and the refusal to panic. By early 1944, the 100th had lost over 200 aircraft. Thousands of men killed, captured, or missing, and yet replacements filled every slot, every seat, every turret. The fortress kept flying. When asked why they kept going, one gunner answered quietly, "Because if we stop, someone else has to take our place." The bloody 100th wasn't defined by how many it lost, but by how many it sent back up the next morning. The legend of the fortress wasn't written in aluminum. It was written in return trips. By early 1944, the sky over Europe had changed color. The contrails that once marked slaughter now marked domination. The Americans had learned the math, and the math was finally turning in their favor. The B-17 had evolved, physically, tactically, philosophically. The new B-17G model rolled off the production line with a key feature: a chin turret under the nose, armed with twin 50 caliber guns. That simple curve of steel erased the bomber's deadliest blind spot, the head-on attack that had killed so many. Now, every angle of approach was covered. The fortress had become what its name promised, a self-defending organism of aluminum and gunfire. But the true revolution came not from steel, but from escort. On February 11, 1944, long-range P-51 Mustangs arrived over Germany for the first time. They were sleek, fast, and had the range to follow the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was the moment the 8th Air Force had been praying for since Schweinfurt. The German pilots saw them first. The formations of B-17s still crawled through the sky as before, but this time, silver fighters swarmed above them like hornets. When the Luftwaffe dove in, the Mustangs dove back, 400 miles per hour of vengeance. The kill ratio flipped overnight. Before, the Luftwaffe claimed 2 bombers for every fighter lost. After the P-51 arrived, it became 5-1, in America's favor. The B-17's survival rate skyrocketed. Missions that once cost a quarter of the fleet now cost less than 5%. Crews began to believe that they might actually live long enough to finish a tour. Even the bombers themselves changed behavior. Freed from constant fighter harassment, they flew tighter formations, more accurate bombing runs, and struck deeper into the Reich: Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, Dresden. On one February raid, the 91st Bomb Group hit the Leipzig aircraft works under perfect escort cover. The sky was a ballet of synchronization. fortresses dropping bombs with precision while Mustangs slashed through the interceptors above. When the formation returned to England, not a single fortress had been lost. It was the first deep penetration mission in history with 0 combat losses. The Germans were stunned. They called it Der große Wandel, the Great Shift. Luftwaffe fuel depots were burning, their factories smashed. Every month after, bomber formations struck new targets: oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, marshalling yards. Germany's industrial heart was turning to dust. The B-17G was the tool that made it possible. It carried 6,000 pounds of bombs at 30,000 feet and returned on one engine if needed. Some flew home missing entire stabilizers. One aircraft, 909, completed 140 missions without losing a single crewman. Mechanics joke that its aluminum skin was more patch than plain. Another fortress, Ye Old Pub, survived a head-on collision with a German fighter. Its pilot, Charlie Brown, barely conscious, nursed the aircraft back to England on 2 engines. The Luftwaffe ace who intercepted him, Franz Stigler, refused to fire on the crippled bomber and instead escorted it out of German airspace. Years later, they met again, as friends. Even the enemy respected the endurance of the fortress. The transformation wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. The fear that had haunted the early raids, the constant knowledge of statistical death, began to fade. Crews started talking about getting to 25 as a goal they might actually reach. Bases that had once been filled with funerals now echoed with laughter, card games, and the metallic click of lucky Garans being field-stripped by gunners. The air war had turned. The same bombers that had limped through Schweinfurt now thundered through German skies in daylight without fear. The Luftwaffe was dying faster than it could replace itself. By June 1944, when the first bombs fell in support of Operation Overlord, the B-17 was no longer a weapon of attrition. It was a weapon of inevitability. From the factory floor in Seattle to the clouds over Berlin, the fortress had become the physical embodiment of Allied endurance, a system perfected through pain. It didn't win by elegance, or by brilliance, or even by overwhelming power. It won by returning, again and again. Each scarred fuselage that touched down on English soil was more than a survivor. It was another data point proving that the war's arithmetic had reversed. The Luftwaffe still fought bravely, but the fortress had stopped fighting for survival. It was now fighting for completion. And soon, that completion would mean Germany itself. By the spring of 1945, the sky over Europe belonged to the fortresses. What had started as a desperate experiment in daylight bombing ended as an industrial symphony, the cold, relentless hum of machines that refused to die. The numbers that once predicted slaughter now measured dominance. The 8th Air Force flew more than 300,000 sorties, dropped 640,000 tons of bombs, and lost 26,000 men. But in the process, it broke the Luftwaffe's spine. The German fighter force that had torn through the formations of 1943 was now fuel-starved, leaderless, and airborne for minutes at a time. The B-17's legend had become something deeper than resilience. It was logic, mechanical, procedural, unstoppable. The fortress didn't need miracles. It just needed systems that worked longer than fear lasted. Every inch of its design had been tested by fire and refined by necessity. 4 engines, each isolated with separate fuel feeds. Self-sealing tanks that closed around holes punched by cannon shells. Redundant cables that let a pilot steer even after hydraulics failed. It was a philosophy made of bolts and rivets. If one part dies, another takes over. That philosophy became the blueprint of Allied warfare. The bomber didn't just survive, it redefined what survive meant. It proved that endurance could be engineered, that courage could be standardized, and that mass production could equal immortality in the air. In the wreckage of the Reich, the evidence was everywhere. Burned-out factories, shattered rail yards, fuel depots reduced to black craters. The same ball-bearing plants that had cost hundreds of fortresses in 1943 were rubble by 1945. The final accounting was brutal. German industrial output dropped by 70%, aviation fuel by 90%. And yet, even in victory, the price was visible. Out of every 100 B-17 crewmen who had taken off from English soil, only 25 completed their tours. The rest were gone, burned, captured, or scattered across the fields of Europe. When those who survived finally returned home, they spoke not of heroics, but of procedure. They said the same phrase again and again. We just stayed in formation. Formation, that single word defined the fortress logic. It wasn't about heroism or improvisation. It was about rhythm, consistency, trust in the system. 100 planes flying as one machine, overlapping fields of fire, one damaged ship carried by the rest. The design worked because the men obeyed its math. A fortress could fly home with one engine gone, half a wing shredded, and a tail full of holes, but only if the crew stayed calm and followed the checklist. A fortress wasn't a plane that saved men. It was a plane that allowed men to save themselves. There's a photograph from 1945 that captures it perfectly. A B-17 sits on a runway at Thorpe Abbotts. The fuselage is torn open from nose to tail. You can see daylight through the holes. The landing gear has collapsed, the wings blackened by fire. Around it stand 10 men, exhausted, grinning faintly. One of them holds a cup of coffee. That image isn't victory. It's endurance. The B-17 didn't symbolize dominance in the way a jet or a battleship did. It symbolized return. The fact that so many came back against all reason, against all odds, turned it into something sacred. In the end, the fortress didn't win because it couldn't be destroyed. It won because it could still fly after it was. Every returning B-17, limping over the channel on one engine, represented the Allied war machine in miniature. Damaged, bleeding, but functional. The sky was its battlefield, and survival was its strategy. The German ace gallant later said, "We could shoot them down. We could not stop them." That's the final verdict. The fortress was not a miracle of flight, it was a miracle of repetition. And in a war built on attrition, repetition is victory. When the war ended, the last B-17s flew home across the Atlantic, patched, oil-streaked, bullet-holed. They had flown into hell and returned. Again and again. Their survival wasn't luck. It was logic made of aluminum. The math of endurance, proven in fire. By May 1945, the last fortresses were gliding home through skies they no longer had to fight for. The air war was finished. Germany's cities burned below them, their rail lines cut, their fuel tanks empty. Every returning B-17 was a symbol of a world that had turned inevitability into machinery. In the hangars of Bavaria, Allied troops found rows of sleek, silver aircraft, MA-262 jet fighters, the miracle weapons that had promised to save the Reich. Some were burned, some half-built, some still smelling of new paint. On paper, they could have changed everything. 540 miles per hour, cannons that could shred a bomber in a single pass. But the math had already been written. The jet was too few, too late, too fragile. Every Me-262 destroyed on the ground meant another fortress over Berlin, another squadron of Mustangs sweeping the sky. Germany had built the future inside a collapsing present, and the future couldn't take off fast enough. The B-17 was slow, heavy, and old by then, but it was everywhere. It had survived flak, fire, and time itself. It didn't win because it was the most advanced. It won because it was ready when it mattered. That's the hidden lesson of the air war. History rewards what can endure, not what can innovate. From the freezing altitudes over Schweinfurt to the last bomb runs over Dresden, the fortress had proven that logic and logistics could outlive genius. The crews who flew her didn't call themselves heroes. They called themselves lucky. And when they stepped down from the cockpit for the last time, they looked back at the bullet-riddled fuselage and said the same thing every pilot said. In every tongue, on every field, she brought us home. But as the world celebrated peace, engineers were already sketching something faster, colder, and stranger. Twin engines, swept wings, pressurized cockpits. The jet age was coming, born from the wreckage of the piston age.